Welcome to This Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because we're going to unpack the fascinating journey of musical notation. Now, we usually just think of sheet music as art, right? But what we're going to see today is how it evolved from this grueling, exhausting test of human memory into a highly advanced, highly engineered form of data encoding. We're going to look at exactly how humans learned to capture the invisible world of sound and somehow put it down onto a physical page. So listen to this. My system reduces the 10 years normally required to become an ecclesiastical singer to a single year. I mean, that sounds exactly like a pitch from a modern Silicon Valley tech founder, doesn't it? But it's not a modern software developer talking. This was actually Guido of Arezzo, a Benedictine monk back in the 11th century. And before we really map out our historical journey today, I just want you to consider this massive technological disruption, because Guido essentially revolutionized how human beings process complex audio data. Here's our quick roadmap for today's explainer. First, the limits of memory. Second, Guido's revolutionary grid. Third, measuring time with shapes. Fourth, the 20th century rebellion. And finally, visualizing modern music. Part 1. The limits of memory and rote memorization. To really understand any great invention, we first have to identify the massive bottleneck that forced it to evolve in the first place. When you map out the history, it's wild how spaced out these innovations are. In the 990s, they were just using basic alphabet notation. By 1025, Guido gives us the 4-line staff. Then jump all the way to the 1270s, and we get strict shape rules for rhythm. And then a massive leap to the 1950s with graphic experimental scores. It shows you that what we think of as standard sheet music didn't just pop up overnight. It's actually the result of a continuous millennium-long technological race to solve very specific communication problems. And here's the core problem they were facing in the early 11th century. How do you record and teach a complex melody to someone who has literally never heard it before? Back then, the Catholic liturgy was rapidly expanding. More feast days meant more chants, and singers were just absolutely drowning in new data that had to be memorized entirely by rote. They were relying on a master to sing it to them over and over and over again. They desperately needed a new system, a way of offload that data from their brains directly onto parchment. Moving on to part 2, Guido's revolutionary grid and revolutionizing pitch. Enter our first major disruptor. Now, the crucial thing to remember here is that innovation usually breeds a little resistance, right? Guido was stationed at the Abbey of Pomposa, and his ideas were so effective and honestly so radically disruptive to the traditional masters there that it caused intense jealousy. His fellow monks were so hostile to his new teaching methods that in 1025, Guido actually had to flee his monastery. He relocated to Arezzo, which was a town that desperately needed a choir trainer, and well, that's where history was made. Once he was safely in Arezzo, Guido just unleashed a suite of innovations. He took existing concepts and perfected them into a 4-line staff, initially using red and yellow lines to establish absolute pitch on a grid. He also invented solfeggio, those syllables ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, which you probably know today as do, re, mi. But what's truly fascinating, and recent research really backs this up, is that Guido may have been synthesizing knowledge from outside Europe. His use of syllables to name notes closely mirrors early Islamic and Andalusian music theorists, like Zaryab, brought into European circles by scholars who had studied in the Muslim world. So Guido was really a master synthesizer of global knowledge. And the impact of his work was just staggering. By mapping exact pitches to lines and spaces and combining that with his syllables, Guido essentially automated musical education. He entirely removed the need for a human master to sing a melody first. A singer could just look at the parchment and know exactly how the tune should sound. It was basically a medieval algorithm for sight reading, and it cut that grueling 10-year learning curve down to just one single year. Section 3. Measuring time with shapes or rhythm as figura. Okay, so Guido completely solved the problem of pitch, but by the late 13th century, a brand new limitation emerges. When you have multiple voices singing totally different melodies at the exact same time, how do you precisely measure their rhythm? To coordinate all these complex harmonies, we get the invention of menstrual notation. Theorists like Franco of Cologne and Magister Lombardus realized that the old modal notation, which just relied on repetitive rhythmic patterns, just wasn't cutting it anymore. They decided that the actual physical shape of the note on the page, its figura, had to represent its exact duration, rather than relying on abstract numbers or numerous. It turned into this beautifully engineered system. You've got the maxima, which is an elongated square, the longa, a square with a stem, the brevis, just a simple square, and the semibrevis, a small diamond or rhombus shape. These shapes locked everything into a strict, highly organized mathematical framework. And if you look at the relationships between them, they're mostly ternary, because in medieval theology, the number 3 represented absolute perfection, so perfect musical time was quite literally divided by 3. Now, think about it. When you're drawing tiny little squares on a piece of parchment, visual confusion is a very real risk. To prevent a singer from accidentally mixing up a long note with a short one, copyists used specific strokes called plicas. By carefully altering the length and the placement of a stroke on a note, say adding a longer stroke to the left side of a brevis, they created clear visual differentiation. It was essentially a foolproof visual code, ensuring absolute rhythmic precision. Which brings us to Section 4, the 20th Century Rebellion and the Emergence of Graphic Notation. But, as we all know, extreme precision definitely has a cost. After centuries of refining this strict code, traditional notation became incredibly restrictive. If the medieval era was all about bringing absolute mathematical order to the chaos of sound, composers in the 1950s wanted to break completely out of that rigid cage. 13th century mensural notation dictated literally everything. The performer was just following strict instructions. But 1950s graphic notation, it's action-based. It enthusiastically embraces chance and indeterminacy. The whole goal was to hand the power of interpretation right back to the performer, making them an active participant in creating the music, not just a playback machine. This massive rebellion was spearheaded by the New York School of Composers, avant-garde pioneers like John Cage, Earl Brown, and Morton Feldman. They completely discarded the traditional 5-line staff, tossed it right out. Instead, they started drawing abstract shapes, lines, and even using graph paper. Morton Feldman's Projection 1 literally looks like a series of abstract boxes. Their goal was to provoke completely unique, unrepeatable musical actions every single time the piece was performed. To really get inside their mindset, just listen to this instruction from John Cage. In his Concert for Piano and Orchestra, he intentionally wrote ambiguous instructions like, play with hands indicated. Where clefs differ, a note is either bass or treble. He's intentionally leaving the decision-making up to the performer in real time. It completely shatters the rigid control the composers had clung to since the days of Franco of Cologne. Finally, Section 5. Visualizing modern music on the digital canvas. Today, this collision between visual art and sound encoding has splintered into just countless, absolutely fascinating directions. The spectrum of graphic scores we see today is incredibly broad. You have time-based pictographs that tell you exactly when to perform a bizarre action. You have totally free abstract scores, like Earl Brown's December 1952, which honestly just looks like floating rectangles. You even have composers like George Crumb, who write traditional notes but bend them into massive, intricate visual spirals. But what's really fun to note here is that treating a score as a visual artwork isn't entirely a modern invention. It actually echoes the 15th century ars subtilior movement. A composer named Baud Cartier literally wrote a piece of music in the shape of a heart, a practice they called eye music. So I guess everything old really is new again. And now technology is pushing the code even further. Thanks to the digital revolution, we're seeing the rise of animated music notation, or AMN. This is a digital approach where movement and visual dynamics on a screen become the very instructions the musician follows. The sheet music isn't static on a page anymore. It flows, it moves, it reacts in real time. So I want to leave you with this thought to chew on. What started as a frustrated monk drawing a red line on a piece of parchment to save some time has evolved over 1,000 years into an infinite digital canvas of visual sound. As animation and interactivity fully merge with musical scoring, how will the music of the future actually look? And perhaps more importantly, what kind of code will the musicians of tomorrow have to invent next just to read it? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it completely changes the way you look at a simple sheet of music.